in a society that kept meticulous records of everything the acreage of an estate, the number of candles burned per quarter, the exact sum a father owed before he could be considered solvent again. A woman's worth was the one figure no one bothered to write down. She could manage a household, balance a ledger, speak 3 languages, and still be referred to in company as the quiet one, as though silence were a character defect rather than the only rational response to a room full of people who had already decided not to listen. Charlotte Hartley was that woman, the one who sat at the end of every table and was never offered the seat nearest the fire, the one whose name appeared on a marriage contract between a bankrupt duke and her father's solicitor, sandwiched between a sum of £100,000 and a clause about the entailment of Marlstoke Hall, as though she were a line item, not a person. No one expected much of her. No one expected anything, really, which is a particular kind of freedom, if you are the sort of woman who knows how to use it. But on the morning of the 3rd year of her marriage, a letter appeared on the Duke of Marlstoke's desk. The door to his study closed from the inside, for the first time anyone could remember. And the man who had not looked at his wife in 1,012 days stood very still with a piece of paper in his hands. There are things, when lost, that cannot be purchased back, not even by a duke. The contract was signed on a Tuesday in October, in a solicitor's office on the Strand that smelled of old paper, coal smoke, and something Charlotte could only describe as defeat. She was 20 years old. Her father sat across the table from a man she had never met, and the man she had never met was Edward Vane, Duke of Marlstoke, and he was signing his name without reading the page beneath his pen. She watched his hand move steady, economical, 3 letters that barely lifted from the paper, and thought that she had never seen anyone sign away a thing of consequence so quickly. Her father nudged the contract toward her. Charlotte, she signed. No one explained what she was agreeing to, beyond the broad outlines she had already been given. The Duke needed liquidity. Her father needed the Duke's title attached to the family name, and Charlotte Hunt was the mechanism by which these 2 needs would be resolved. The solicitor, a narrow man named Holloway, who wore his cravat too tight, folded the papers with the careful satisfaction of someone who had just completed a difficult piece of carpentry. Lavinia Stein, Charlotte's cousin by her mother's side, sat in the corner chair and watched with the particular attention of a woman cataloging what she stood to gain. The wedding took place 8 days later in the chapel at Marlstoke Hall, Derbyshire. 8 minutes, Charlotte counted. The Reverend Dunnet spoke quickly, as men do when the congregation has somewhere else to be. There were 12 guests, most of them tenants who had come out of obligation rather than celebration, and a cold buffet in the entrance hall that no one touched. Edward shook her father's hand. He did not shake hers. He offered a single nod in her direction, the sort of nod one gives a piece of furniture that has been placed adequately, and then walked through a door at the far end of the hall and did not reappear. Charlotte stood in the entrance hall in her mother's altered wedding dress, with a glass of wine she had not asked for, and a new name she could not yet learn to answer to, and understood that this was what her life was now. She did not cry. She found when she looked for tears that there were none waiting. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity, the kind that arrives when the last uncertain thing has finally resolved itself into certainty, however bleak. Nan, who had been Charlotte's lady's maid since Charlotte was 16, and who had the habit of expressing entire paragraphs through the angle of her eyebrows, appeared at her elbow with a plate of cold ham, and the expression of a woman prepared to be outraged on someone else's behalf. "The dining room is through there," Nan said. "I had them lay a place." Charlotte followed her. The dining room held a table long enough to seat 20, and one chair pulled out and nearest the window pulled out by Nan, because no one else had thought to do it. Charlotte sat down. She ate alone. The candle in the brass holder at her elbow burned low before she was finished, and she carried it herself when she went upstairs, because no one had thought to light the sconces in the east corridor. She put the candle on the windowsill of her room and watched it until it went out. She was back in the dining room at 7 the following morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the next 3 years. She learned the rhythms of Marlstoke Hall, the way you learn any foreign country, by observation, by small mistakes, by asking questions of people who were not the obvious people to ask. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Hesba, who had served the Vane family for 20 years, was guarded at first, then cautiously helpful, then by the end of the first month openly relieved. The estate had been managed by a steward named Bexley, who kept excellent records of the money coming in and increasingly creative records of the money going out. Charlotte found the first discrepancy in her 5th week. She found 11 more by the end of October. She did not bring them to Edward. She had tried once in the 2nd week to speak to him about the tenant rolls. 3 families in the north quarter of the estate had not been properly registered, which meant they were paying rent without legal protection, which was both morally untenable and practically risky. She had knocked on the study door at a reasonable hour. He had said from within, "Leave it with Bexley." She had not knocked again. Instead, she began keeping her own ledger. In a small notebook she bought herself from the village stationer, in handwriting so small it looked like a different language. By the end of the 1st year, she understood the estate better than anyone living in it. By the end of the 2nd year, she had introduced herself to every tenant family, arranged for proper legal registration of the 3 families in the north quarter, identified which fields were being under-farmed and which being over-fertilized, methodically through a solicitor in Derby who did not know whose wife she was, purchasing the outstanding debt notes attached to Marlstoke Hall one by one. She used her pin money first. Then the housekeeping surplus she had generated by renegotiating 3 supplier contracts. Then a small sum from the sale of a piece of jewelry her father had given her, which she had never worn. No one noticed. That was the point of being invisible. House ran better than it had in a decade. The tenants were healthier. The accounts showed a surplus for the first time in Hesba's memory. And Charlotte sat in the kitchen after supper most evenings, because she did not have a study, and worked through the figures by lamplight, while Nan pretended not to watch her. Edward was present in the house the way weather is present as a condition rather than a person. She heard his footsteps overhead sometimes, or the sound of a door. She saw him at dinner 3 times a week, which was the arrangement they had fallen into without discussing it. And they spoke in the careful, neutral way of 2 people who have agreed not to speak about anything that matters. He was not unkind. She was never afraid of him. She was simply not seen, in the specific way that a woman can be not seen by someone who is looking directly at her face. There was a Tuesday in the 2nd November. She remembered it as the day the first snow came down, early and sideways and stubborn, when she had been in the kitchen until past midnight working through an error in the quarterly accounts. She came upstairs to find that a tray had been left outside her door. Tea, a piece of shortbread, the small brass candle holder from the dining room. The tea was hot. She stood in the corridor for a long moment with the tray in her hands, and then she carried it inside and did not think too carefully about who had sent it, because she understood, with a precision born of long practice, that hoping for too much was a form of damage she could not afford. She thought about that tray often in the year that followed. It was the only time. By the 3rd year, she had purchased enough of the outstanding debt to hold a controlling position, quietly, at arm's length, under a name that was and was not her own. She had saved Marlstoke Hall from 3 separate creditors who would have moved against the estate before Christmas of the previous year. She had done this without telling anyone, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. She had told herself this was simply the logical thing to do, that she lived here, that it was in her interest, that the tenants depended on stability, that Thomas the Carter's youngest child needed medicine that only arrived reliably when the estate accounts were in order. She had told herself all of this, and it was all true, and it was also not the only truth. In September of the third year, on a morning when the light came through the east windows of her room in a way that made the whole corridor look like something out of a life she had not been given, Charlotte sat at the small writing table under the window and wrote a letter. She wrote it carefully in her best hand, and she did not cry while she wrote it, and when she was finished, she folded it and sealed it and set it on the desk in the study while Edward was out riding, because she had decided, finally, that she could not spend the rest of her life being useful to a man who had not once, in 3 years, looked at her as though she were anything other than a satisfactory arrangement. The letter said this, that she was grateful for the security his name had provided, that she hoped the estate would continue to thrive, that she had made arrangements for the transition of the accounts and would leave the relevant documentation with Halloway, that she wished him well, that she was leaving. She did not say where she was going. She did not say goodbye to anyone except Nan, who folded her into an embrace that lasted considerably longer than was strictly appropriate, and said very quietly into Charlotte's hair, "You should have gone 2 years ago, love, and you should never have had to go at all." Charlotte picked up her traveling bag, one bag, because she had arrived with very little and had never been given reason to accumulate more, and walked to the front door of Marlstoke Hall. She did not take the candle. She left it on the windowsill in her room, where she had put it on the first night, still in its brass holder. Edward came back from his ride at 10:30 in the morning. He went to his study. He found the letter. He read it standing, which was not how he normally read correspondence. He read it a second time. Then he stood very still, with the paper between his hands, not gripping, not crushing, just holding, and the fire in the grate ticked quietly, and the house was absolutely, completely silent. And he understood, in the way you understand things that you should have understood 3 years ago, that the silence was new. He had been living in a house with a woman in it. Now he was living in a house. The rules of their marriage had not been written down anywhere. That was the problem with rules that emerged from silence rather than agreement. They accumulated, like sediment, layer by layer, until the riverbed was entirely different from what it had been, and no one could say exactly when the change had happened. Breakfast was separate. This had begun in the first week, when Charlotte had come down at 7 to find the dining room empty and a note from Hesba explaining that His Grace took his morning meal in the study. Charlotte had eaten alone, and the following morning she had eaten alone again, and by the third morning it was no longer a temporary arrangement, but a fact of the household, as fixed as the angle of the roof. Dinner was together on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. This too had calcified without discussion, the result of Charlotte appearing in the dining room on those evenings and Edward appearing as well, and neither of them suggesting an alternative. They spoke about the weather. They spoke about the condition of the South Road. On one occasion, in February of the first year, Edward had asked whether she had found the library adequate, and she had said yes, and he had nodded, and that had been the most personal exchange they had managed in 4 months. The study was his. The morning room was hers by default, since he did not use it. The east corridor was hers by proximity. The grounds were technically shared, but in practice divided by habit. She walked her Parker toward the kitchen gardens and the tenant cottages. He rode toward the upper fields and the tree line. They were two people conducting lives within the same walls, with the same name on the gate. And the arrangement worked in the precise way that arrangements work when neither party makes demands on the other. Smoothly, coldly, and without any of the small frictions that would have indicated actual contact. Lavinia had arrived 3 weeks after the wedding, with 2 trunks and the stated intention of staying for a month or two while the London house is being aired. The month became a season, the season became a year, and by the second autumn, Lavinia had a preferred chair in the drawing room and opinions about the placement of the furniture, which she expressed to Hesba and not to Charlotte, on the grounds Charlotte understood illicitly that Hesba was a permanent fixture and Charlotte might not be. Lavinia was not cruel to her face. She was the other kind of cruel, which is more durable. The kind that operates through omission, through the slightly raised eyebrow, through the habit of addressing Charlotte's suggestions at dinner, as though they had been made by the table itself rather than a person. Edward never appeared to notice. This was, Charlotte had concluded by the end of the first year, not because he was stupid. He was demonstrably not stupid. He read 3 newspapers a day and corresponded with men of considerable consequence, and managed what remained of a complex financial situation with a precision that was almost admirable, but because he had made, at some earlier point in his life, the decision that emotions were information he did not need. He had filed Charlotte under satisfactory arrangement and Lavinia under Charlotte's relation, present in the house, and had left both assessments unrevised. It was not malice. It was something Charlotte found, in some ways, harder to work with than malice. It was indifference of the architectural kind, built into the structure rather than chosen each day. The closest they had come to an actual conversation in the entire second year was on a Thursday morning in March, when she had been in the kitchen reviewing the quarterly accounts, and he had come through looking for Bexley. He had stopped when he saw her. His gaze had moved from her face to the ledger open on the table to the stack of correspondence she had organized by creditor name and payment date. He had not said anything for a moment. Then, "Is there something you need from Bexley?" She had said, "No, I'm reviewing the winter accounts." He had said, "Bexley handles the accounts." She had looked at him steadily and said, "Yes, I know." He had found Bexley and gone. But she had noticed 2 days later that the study door was ajar in the mornings when she passed it, not open, but no longer fully closed. She had not known what to do with that, so she had done nothing. The management of Marlstoke Hall's finances was, in theory, Bexley's domain. In practice, by the beginning of the second year, it was Charlotte's. Bexley had understood this before she did, with the instinct of a man whose creative accounting had just encountered someone who noticed the creativity. He had not confronted her. He had simply become cooperative, almost eager, in a way that told her he had calculated that her competence was less dangerous to him than her suspicion. She let him keep his position and his dignity and the fiction that he was still in charge, because the tenants knew him and change was expensive, and because she was not interested in winning visible battles. She was interested in the accounts being accurate. The surplus in the Trang-Tri accounts appeared for the first time in the ledger of the second autumn, and Bexley mentioned it to Edward with the careful neutrality of a man reporting a weather change. "The Trang-Tri accounts are running ahead, Your Grace." Some adjustments to the supplier arrangements. Edward had nodded. He had not asked what adjustments, or who had made them, or how a household that had been operating at a consistent deficit for 6 years had managed to generate a surplus of nearly £400. Charlotte had been in the doorway when this exchange happened, passing through on her way to the kitchen, and she had heard it and walked on and said nothing, because she was not in the habit of announcing things, and because she had learned early that the most useful position in any room was the one no one was watching. That evening at dinner Wednesday, therefore, at one of their shared meals, Edward had looked up from his plate and said, without preamble, "The accounts are running well." It was addressed to the middle of the table, which was his usual approach when he wanted to say something without quite saying it to her specifically. Charlotte had reached for the salt. "Yes," she said, "the third quarter was better than expected." He had looked at her then, for approximately 3 seconds, with an expression she could not fully read, not quite surprise, not quite assessment, something between the two. Then he had looked back at his plate. That had been the end of it. She had gone to bed that night and lain awake for a while, and then she had been cross with herself for lying awake, because she understood exactly what she was doing, and she had promised herself, at the beginning, that she would not do it. The note about the tea tray, in November of the second year, had no signature. Hesba, when Charlotte asked, said only that she hadn't sent it. Nan, when Charlotte asked, raised both eyebrows and said, "I was in the laundry." Charlotte had not asked again. She had bought another debt note in December, through Halloway's counterpart in Derby, for a sum that represented 6 months of careful household economy. The man she was buying it from had no idea who the eventual holder would be. The chain of intermediaries was her design, modeled on something she had read about in a book on commercial practice that she had borrowed from the Marlstoke library and returned with no annotation and considerable new understanding. She was patient. She was methodical. She was, in the language of the estate, invisible. By the end of the second winter, she held notes representing nearly a third of the total outstanding debt. She was not sure, yet, what she intended to do with them. What she knew was that she felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was not subsisting inside someone else's arrangement, but constructing one of her own quietly, without permission, one debt note at a time. This, she understood, was not the same as happiness, but it was not nothing. In the spring of the third year, Thomas fell ill. He was 7 years old, the youngest child of the Crail family who farmed the North Quarter, and he had the kind of cough that started wet and stayed wet and did not improve with warmth or time. Charlotte had visited the Craigle cottage twice a week since the previous autumn, partly because old William Crail was one of the tenants who had been improperly registered and she felt a specific responsibility toward his family, and partly because Thomas had a habit of sitting on the fence post when she came up the lane and informing her, very seriously, of whatever he considered the most important news of the day. The news was usually about a dog or a bird or what his sister Bess had done that morning. Charlotte listened to all of it with complete attention. When the cough began, she brought a preparation from the village apothecary, a comtune she had some confidence in, having read through the small medical text the previous housekeeper had kept at Marlstoke for estate emergencies. She was not a doctor. She said so plainly to William Crail, who nodded and said he knew that, and that the nearest doctor was 8 miles away and charged a fee he could not manage. So whatever Charlotte had in that basket was more than what he would otherwise have. She came back 4 days later, and the cough was better. She came back the week after, and Thomas was on the fence post again, thinner than before but present, with news about a fox that had gotten into the grain store. Nan, who accompanied Charlotte on these visits, said nothing about them to anyone in the main house. This was not because she was instructed not to. It was simply that Nan had been Charlotte's ally long enough to understand the difference between what Charlotte did and what the house needed to know Charlotte was doing. Edward found out, not from Nan, but from Bexley, who mentioned in passing with more careful neutrality heed to all financial observations that the apothecary in the village had been settled by the household accounts, and that the amounts suggested ongoing rather than incidental purchases. Edward had said, "For what?" And Bexley had said, "For the Krill child, I believe, the North Quarter family." Edward had not responded immediately. He had looked at the account entry for a moment. Then he said, "Keep it in the accounts," and that had been that. He did not mention it to Charlotte. She did not know he knew. The following week, when she came down for the Wednesday dinner and found that the fireplace in the dining room had been freshly stoked rather than at its usual modest level, and that her chair, which was at the end of the table, furthest from the heat, had been moved 3 feet closer to the grate, she noticed. She sat down. She said nothing. Edward arrived 4 minutes later, took his place at the head of the table, and opened the discussion of the South Road as usual. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked at the fire, and then she helped herself to the soup, and she did not allow herself to read more into a rearranged chair than a rearranged chair warranted. But she remembered it. She filed it next to the tea tray and the note from November in the part of her mind where she kept things she had decided not to think about too carefully, and she left them there. It was 3 weeks after this that she began writing the letter. She did not write it all at once. She started it on a Sunday, folded it away unfinished, and came back to it over several evenings. Each time she read what she had written, she looked for the self-pity in it and took it out. She did not want to leave a letter that asked for anything or accused anyone of anything. She wanted to leave a letter that was accurate, that was honest about what had happened and what had not happened, and what she had finally concluded was not going to happen. She had been useful. She had done good work. She had managed, without being asked, to hold together a household and an estate, and a financial structure that would have collapsed without her. And she had done it in the hope, a hope she had not fully admitted to herself, until she sat down to write this letter, that eventually someone would look up from the papers and see her. No one had looked up. She sealed the letter on a Thursday morning, walked it to the study while Edward was out riding, set it on his desk beside the inkstand, and left. Edward had not ridden for pleasure since his brother died. He rode because the horse needed exercise, and the upper fields needed inspection, and because there were mornings more of them lately, though he would not have named the reason when the walls of the study pressed too close and he needed a horizon. He was back by 10:30. He unsaddled the horse himself, which was a habit from his years in the army and one he had never broken, and he walked to the house through the kitchen garden because the gate on the east side was closer than the front entrance. He went to the study. He found the letter. He read it standing up, because he had been moving when he entered the room and had not stopped, and by the time he registered what he was holding it seemed too late to sit. He read it a second time, then a third. The handwriting was precise, and even Charlotte wrote the way she did everything, with a neatness that suggested not effort, but the complete absence of carelessness. The words were courteous. They were measured. They were exactly what they appeared to be, which was a woman explaining, without complaint and without drama, that she was leaving and why, in terms so reasonable that there was not a single sentence he could point to and call unfair. He stood with the letter in his hands for some time. The fire ticked outside through the window. The kitchen garden was gray and damp and entirely unresponsive to whatever was happening in the study. Edward was not, in general, a man who had difficulty deciding what to do. He had run an estate, a regiment, a set of complex financial negotiations that had very nearly ruined him, and had then stopped ruining him. He made decisions every day without particular difficulty. He put the letter down. He picked it up again. He went to the door and called for Nan. Nan arrived with an expression that told him she had been expecting this or something like it, which told him in turn that she knew more about where Charlotte had gone than she intended to share without persuasion. He asked directly where Charlotte was. Nan said she couldn't say. He asked whether she meant couldn't as in did not know, or couldn't as in would not. Nan said with a composure that he recognized as Charlotte's by association, the second one, Your Grace. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. She left a forwarding address with Holloway, Nan added, after a pause in case of estate matters. He nodded. She left. He sat down. Then he stood up. He looked at the letter again. He looked at the fire. He thought about the last 3 years with a deliberateness he had not applied to them while they were happening, and what came back was a series of images he had not known he had catalogued. Charlotte in the kitchen with the ledger. Charlotte at dinner, 2 feet closer to the fire than she had used to be, because he had moved her chair. Charlotte, stopping 3 paces from the gate of the Crail cottage, with a basket over her arm, and old William Crail's face doing something complicated with relief. Charlotte, sitting at the end of a very long dining table, with a candle burning low beside her on the first night, eating alone, and not once in 3 years had he asked her why she had not moved the candle to a better position, or asked for more light, or done anything other than simply accept the circumstances she had been handed. He had told himself for 3 years that the arrangement was satisfactory because she had not said otherwise. He understood now, reading her letter, that a woman who had spent her entire life making herself small enough to fit whatever space was available was perhaps not the best source of information about whether the space was sufficient. He sent for his horse. He was in Derby by 2 in the afternoon, at Halloway's office by 1:30, and in possession of a forwarding address, a coaching inn in Ashwick, 8 miles east by 3. He was also in possession, unexpectedly, of a great deal of other information, because Halloway, who had the solicitor's instinct for arriving at difficult conversations through the side door, had taken the opportunity to raise a matter he had been meaning to raise for some weeks. The matter was the debt notes. Halloway laid it out with professional precision. Over the past 3 years, the outstanding debt attached to Marlstoke Hall had been quietly and systematically purchased by a third party through a chain of intermediaries that had only recently become traceable. The purchasing party held notes representing approximately 62% of the total outstanding debt. They were, as of last month, in a position to call those notes simultaneously, which would give them effective financial control over the estate. The purchasing party had not done this. Instead, they appeared to be holding the notes with no stated intention and no demand. Halloway had traced the chain as far as he could. The final name on the documents, he said, and set a paper on the desk, is Charlotte Vane, née Hartley. Edward looked at the paper. He looked at Halloway. "How long?" he said. Halloway said, "Nearly 3 years, Your Grace. Since approximately the 3rd month of her residence at Marlstoke Hall." Edward did not say anything. Halloway, with considerable professional courage, continued. "She saved the estate from 3 separate creditors in the 2nd year alone. If they had moved against the notes before she acquired them, Marlstoke Hall would have been subject to forced sale proceedings by last Christmas." Edward picked up the paper. He set it down. He stood. "Is she at the inn in Ashwick?" Halloway said, "As of this morning, yes." Edward was at the door when Halloway added, "There is one other matter, Your Grace." He turned. "The Stein woman. I have reason to believe she has been interfering with the terms of the trust established under Charlotte's father's will. If Charlotte established residence independent of the Marlstoke household for more than 30 days, Stein has indicated she intends to contest the trust on grounds of abandonment." Edward looked at him for a long moment. "Get the documents," he said. "All of them. Tonight." He rode back toward Ashwick. The road was soft from the rain, and the light was going, and he was pushed harder than was wise, because something that had been sitting in his chest since he read the letter that morning was now considerably louder, and he did not have a satisfactory name for it yet, but he recognized it by its behavior, which was the behavior of a thing that becomes aware, too late, that it has been standing next to something irreplaceable, and mistook it for furniture. He reached Ashwick as the lamps were being lit. The coaching inn was on the high street, a decent house, the kind Charlotte would have chosen for its respectability rather than comfort. He went inside. The innkeeper said that the lady had gone out the auction house on the square, the one holding the Thursday land sales. Edward turned around and went back into the street. Lavinia was already at the auction house. He saw her carriage on the far side of the square before he saw the building, and something in the particular angle of that carriage parked too close to the entrance, with the deliberateness of a person who intends to be seen arriving, made him stop walking for a moment and look at it carefully. He had known, in the abstract, that Lavinia was a problem. He had not paid sufficient attention to the specific ways in which she was a problem, because he had not paid sufficient attention to Charlotte, and Lavinia's operations required Charlotte's invisibility to function. He understood this now with the comprehensive clarity of a man who has just had 3 years of information reorganized into a pattern he should have seen from the beginning. He did not go into the auction house, not yet. He went first to find Holloway's associate in Ashwick, a young man named Prine who had been sent ahead with the documents and collected what he needed. Then he stood in the street outside the auction house and looked at the lit windows and thought, with a precision he had not previously applied to anything involving Charlotte Vane, about what he was going to do and in what order. He did not go home for his dinner. He was not hungry. He folded the papers Prine had given him into his coat and crossed the square. The auction house on Ashwick's Market Square had been a grain warehouse in a previous life, and it had never entirely lost the character of one. The ceiling was too high, the walls too bare, and the light from the oil lamps hung in the upper air in a way that made the room feel simultaneously too large and too close. There were perhaps 40 people present: landowners, solicitors, a handful of tenant farmers who had pooled money toward a small parcel of grazing land in the East Quarter, and several men Charlotte did not recognize who had the particular stillness of professional bidders. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Dunnett, no relation to the Reverend, he had informed her when she arrived, stood at the front with a wooden gavel and the professionally cheerful manner of someone who had learned to be pleasant about other people's financial difficulties. Charlotte had arrived an hour before the sale began and had spent the time reviewing the lot listings and speaking quietly with a solicitor named Kessel, whom she had engaged 3 weeks prior, not the Kessel who had come to Marlstoke in the spring, but his younger brother, who was considerably less expensive and considerably more willing to work with a woman who knew what she wanted. The lot she was concerned with was number 7, a parcel of 12 acres adjacent to the eastern boundary of the trust property established under her father's will. The parcel was irrelevant in itself. What mattered was the access road that crossed it, which was the only between the trust property and the main highway. Whoever held that parcel controlled, in effect, whether the trust property was usable at all. Lavinia knew this. Charlotte had understood, from the moment Holloway's letter arrived 2 weeks ago warning her of Lavinia's intentions, that the parcel was the target. Lavinia could not contest the trust directly. The documentation was sound, and the witnesses were alive, and the signatures were indisputably her father's. But if she acquired the access road, she could make the trust property functionally worthless, which would give her grounds to argue that Charlotte had abandoned a valueless asset rather than a viable inheritance, which was a different legal argument and a considerably more complicated one to defeat. Charlotte had arrived in Ashwick prepared for this. She had spent the previous 2 weeks in correspondence with Kessel and in careful review of a document she had carried with her from Marlstoke Hall in the bottom of her traveling bag, the original trust deed with both witnesses' signatures, which her father's solicitor had given her on the day she turned 21, and which she had kept, without mentioning it to anyone, in a small locked box beneath the lining of the largest of her 2 trunks. She had known when she married Edward that the trust existed. She had known that Lavinia knew it existed. She had not known until Holloway's letter the specific mechanism Lavinia intended to use. Now she knew, and she had, she believed, what she needed. Lot 7 came up at 7:30 in the evening. The room had thinned somewhat. The grazing land had sold quickly, and several of the tenant farmers had gone home. Lavinia was in the 3rd row, very straight-backed, with her own solicitor, a man Charlotte recognized from her father's household, which told her something useful about how long this plan had been in preparation. Charlotte was standing at the side of the room, near the door, with Kessel beside her. The bidding opened. Lavinia's solicitor entered immediately, with a bid that was slightly above what the parcel was worth, in the manner of someone who wishes to discourage competition rather than acquire property economically. Charlotte nodded to Kessel. Kessel bid. Lavinia's solicitor bid again higher. The auctioneer looked pleased. The room looked interested. Charlotte counted the bids and kept her expression entirely neutral, because she had learned, from 3 years of managing creditors and suppliers and tenant negotiations, that the face you showed while money was moving was as important as the money itself. It was at this point that the door opened. She heard it rather than saw it a draft, the particular sound of a heavy door on a winter evening. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. Kessel, beside her, shifted slightly. She heard, from across the room, the sound of someone stopping. She still did not look. The bidding continued for another 2 rounds. Then, from behind her, and to the left from the direction of the door, a voice said, £1,000. The room went quiet. The auctioneer blinked. £1,000 was more than 4 times the assessed value of the parcel. Lavinia's solicitor turned to Lavinia. Lavinia turned toward the source of the voice. Charlotte finally turned. Edward was standing near the door, with his coat still damp from the road, and an expression Charlotte had not seen on his face before, not the controlled neutrality she was accustomed to, not the administrative distance, but something stripped back and undefended, the expression of a man who has recently learned something that reorganized the entire structure of what he thought he knew and has not yet finished reorganizing it. He was looking at her. Not at the auctioneer, not at Lavinia, not at the room, at her. The auctioneer said, £1,000, do I have a counter? Lavinia's solicitor looked at Lavinia. Lavinia's jaw was set, but she was calculating. £1,000 for a 12-acre access road was indefensible economically and socially. She gave a very small shake of her head. The solicitor sat back. Sold, the auctioneer said, with the mild bewilderment of a man who has just had an excellent evening unexpectedly. The room resumed its noise. Charlotte did not move. Edward crossed toward her, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who is deciding what to say and has not yet decided. He stopped 3 paces away. He looked at her face. She looked at his. The last time they had been this close standing, looking at each other directly, she could not immediately remember, because there had not been many occasions of that kind in 3 years of marriage. He said, I spoke with Holloway. She said, I know. He said, the debt notes. She said, yes. He did not say anything for a moment. The room was moving around them, people gathering coats and papers, and Lavinia was still in the 3rd row with her solicitor and the specific rigidity of someone who knows she has just lost a round and is recalculating. Charlotte was aware of all of this and paid it no particular attention, because Edward's face was doing something she had not seen it do before, which was the reason she could not look away. How long did you know, he said, that the estate was at risk? From approximately the 6th week, she said. There were 11 discrepancies in the accounts before the end of the first autumn. You didn't tell me. I knocked on your study door in the 2nd week. You said to leave it with Bexley. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, watched the specific quality of stillness that came over him, which was the stillness of a man doing arithmetic that keeps coming out the same way, no matter how he runs the numbers. The surplus, he said. Yes, the creditor in the spring, Kessel, his brother. The elder Kessel was the one who came to the house. I sent him away and arranged terms with the holding company directly. It took 3 meetings. You had 3 meetings, he said, with a creditor on behalf of my estate and told no one. You had made it quite clear, she said very quietly, that the accounts were Bexley's domain. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze because she was done, she had decided, with the practice of making herself smaller than she was in order to fit into the space she had been allocated. She was not angry. She was not performing composure. She was simply, for perhaps the first time since she had signed her name in Halloway's office 3 years ago, standing exactly as large as she actually was. Charlotte, he said. Just her name. He said it differently from the way he had said it before, not as an address, not as a way of getting her attention, but as though he were testing whether the word still meant what he thought it meant, and discovering that it meant considerably more. Your Grace, she said. His mouth tightened, not with displeasure, with the specific expression of a man who has just understood that he has been addressed formally by the woman who saved his estate for 3 years without being axed, and that he deserves it. He looked down at his coat. He reached into the inner pocket and drew out a folded document. She could see Halloway's seal on the outside. He did not hand it to her yet. I owe you, he said, an explanation of my own. She waited. The woman before you, he said, and his voice was careful, the way it was careful when he was saying something he had not said before and was aware of the danger of saying it wrong, used what I told her to. It does not matter. I decided afterward that I would not. I arranged things so that nothing could be. He stopped. He looked at the paper in his hands. I arranged things, he said again, so that there would be no risk. I made our marriage into a contract because contracts are legible, because you cannot be betrayed by a document. He paused. I understand, he said, that this is not a complete explanation. No, she said, it is not, I know. Outside, through the high windows, the lamps on the market square were coming on one by one. Lavinia had left the room. Charlotte had not seen her go, but the third row was empty. Kessel was packing his papers with the careful efficiency of a man giving his clients as much privacy as a public room allowed. Edward held out the document. Before I came in here, he said, I signed the estate management into your name, the full authority. Halloway has the copies. She looked at the document but did not take it. He looked at her, looking at it. I understand, he said, if that is not sufficient. It is not a question of sufficiency, she said. It is a question of whether you understand what you are signing, or whether you are doing it because you are frightened. His head came up, not offended, something else. Both, he said. I understand it, and I am frightened. They are not mutually exclusive. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. The room was nearly empty now. Some was there outside. A horse moved in the square, and the sound came through the high windows and dissolved. She said, I have not agreed to come back. I know, he said. He did not press. He held the document, and he waited, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has understood, perhaps for the first time, that waiting is not the same as indifference, and that he has a great deal of it still to demonstrate. She turned and went to find Kessel, because there were still papers to finalize before the evening was done. She did not look back. She did not need to. She knew without looking that he was still standing there. The papers took 40 minutes. Kessel was thorough, which was what Charlotte had paid him for, and the transfer of the access road parcel into the trust, which was the correct legal destination for it. As Kessel confirmed, with the satisfied precision of a man who has found an elegant solution to a problem someone else created, required 3 signatures and 2 witnesses drawn from the small group of Ashwick solicitors who worked late on auction nights. Charlotte signed her name twice. The second time, she signed it Charlotte Vane, née Hartley, and then sat for a moment with the pen in her hand and looked at the ink drying. Edward was not in the room during this process. He had gone to speak to Halloway's associate, Prine, who was waiting in the entrance hall with additional documents, and Charlotte could hear, through the thin partition, the low specific cadence of men arranging legal matters at speed. She did not listen to the content. She concentrated on her own papers. When Kessel had finished, and the documents were folded and sealed and distributed to their correct destinations, Charlotte put on her coat, picked up her bag, and went out into the entrance hall. Prine was there, sorting papers. Edward was not. She went outside. The market square was quiet now. The auction crowd dispersed. The the lamplighter long finished. The air was cold and damp, and smelled of wet stone, and the particular sharpness of an October night that has not quite decided whether to rain. Charlotte stood on the top step of the auction house and looked at the square, and did not find Edward there either, and experienced a sensation she recognized from practice. The sensation of having prepared carefully for a thing and then discovering that the thing had changed shape in the interval between preparation and arrival. She went down the steps. She turned left toward the inn because she had a room there, and it was cold, and she was tired in the specific way she got tired when she had been running on precision for too long, and the precision had finally finished being necessary. She had gone perhaps 30 feet when she heard him behind her. Charlotte. She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She took one breath, and then another, and then she turned. He was standing in the middle of the square, hatless, with his coat open despite the cold, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand and looking at her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and has now decided, at the last moment, not to say it. She waited. He crossed toward her. He stopped, as he had inside. 3 paces away, she was beginning to understand that 3 paces was his distance, the one he chose when he wanted to be close but was not yet certain he had the right. "The letter," he said. "Your letter, yes. You said you had made arrangements for the transition of the accounts." His voice was not quite steady. She noticed this and filed it carefully. "You had planned this before today. For several weeks," she said. "I wanted to ensure the estate would not be disrupted. You were managing a transition," he said, "so that when you left, the thing you had spent 3 years building would not collapse." "Yes. On behalf of an estate that did not belong to you." "It belongs to Marlstoke," she said. "The tenants belong to Marlstoke. Thomas Crail and his family belong to Marlstoke. The question of whether it belonged to me was not the point." He looked at her. The lamplight from the nearest post was doing something complicated to the angle of his face, not flattering, not dramatic, simply honest. The way lamplight is when there is no arrangement to it. "I read the letter 4 times, he said. "There is nothing in it about what you wanted." She said nothing. "You said what you were grateful for. You said what you were leaving. You said what you had arranged. There is not one sentence about what you wanted." She looked at the paper in his hand. "What is that?" He looked down at it as though he had forgotten he was holding it. "It is a contract," he said. "I am aware that is not, I understand. That is not the correct." He stopped. He unfolded the paper and held it out to her. She took it. She read it by the lamplight. It was, as he had said, a contract. It was written in his hand, not Halloway's, which meant he had written it himself tonight at some point between Halloway's office and the auction house. It had one clause. The clause read, "In consideration of the terms herein, Charlotte Vane, née Hartley, agrees to remain at Marlstoke Hall as its primary resident and sole manager of its affairs, with full legal authority over all estate matters, for a period of no less than her natural life. In consideration of same, Edward Vane, Duke of Marlstoke, agrees to look up." She read it twice. She read it a 3rd time. She looked at the last 2 words. She looked at him. "That is not a legally enforceable clause," she said. "I know," he said. "It is the only clause I was certain I could keep." She held the paper. The wind moved across the square, and she felt the cold through her coat, and the lamplight was very still and steady, and she had spent 3 years telling herself she could not afford to hope for this, could not build anything on this, could not let herself want this, and she had been right. She had been correct in every practical assessment she had ever made, and none of it had made the wanting stop. "You did not look up," she said, "for 3 years. No. I knocked on the door in the 2nd week. I know." His voice was low and direct and stripped of every protection he had apparently decided, tonight, to remove. "I was a coward in a very specific and long-standing way, and I dressed it up as practicality, and I cost us 3 years. And I have no argument to make about that. There is no argument." She folded the paper. She held it. He watched her hold it. The candle, she said. He looked at her. She said, in November. Second, the tray outside the door. Yes, that was you, yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. He did not offer anything further, no additional argument, no embellishment, no attempt to fill the silence with something more persuasive. He simply stood there in the middle of the Ashwick Market Square, with his coat open and the wind pulling at his hair, and waited with a steadiness that was different from his usual stillness, because his usual stillness had been about keeping things out, and this was about something else entirely. She said, I have not agreed to come back, I know. I am still thinking, I know. She put the contract in her coat pocket. She looked at his face one more moment, and then she turned and walked back toward the inn. He did not follow her. She heard him not follow her, and she was grateful for it. And she walked the 30 feet to the inn door and went inside, and she did not make any decisions that night, because she had learned over 3 years not to make decisions in the immediate aftermath of something that had rearranged the ground under her feet. She sat by the window of her room and looked out at the square. The lamp on the post was still lit. He was gone from the square. She held the contract in her lap and did not read it again because she had it memorized, and she sat there for a long time in the quiet. In the morning, Nan arrived at 7:30 with tea and the expression of someone who had already heard everything and was waiting with considerable patience to find out what Charlotte intended to do about it. Charlotte drank the tea. She thought about Thomas on the fence post. She thought about the surplus in the accounts, and the chain of debt notes, and 3 years of work done in kitchens and corridors and on the backs of envelopes because she had not been given a desk. She thought about a chair moved 3 feet toward a fire. She thought about the specific way Edward had said her name in the auction house, not as an address, but as a question he had finally decided to ask. She thought about what it would mean to go back and what it would mean not to, and she was honest with herself about both. She went back, not because she had been persuaded and not because she had forgiven everything, and not because the contract in her pocket was legally enforceable. She went back because she had built something at Marlstoke Hall, not for him, not for the title, not for the arrangement, and it was hers, and she was not prepared to leave it in the hands of someone who had not at least learned to look up, without ensuring that he was, in fact, beginning to learn. She arrived at Marlstoke Hall at 2:30 in the afternoon. Hesba met her at the door with the expression of a woman who had never doubted this outcome and was too professional to say so. Nan, who had preceded Charlotte by an hour, appeared in the corridor behind Hesba with both eyebrows in a position that communicated satisfaction. Charlotte set her bag down. She went to the morning room. She sat at the writing table. She picked up the pen. She heard Edward's footsteps in the corridor. She knew his footsteps by now, 3 years of knowing them, the slight unevenness from an old injury he had never explained. They stopped outside the morning room door, a pause, then a knock. She said, "Come in." He came in. He did not sit down because she had not invited him to sit, and he was learning, she could see it already, the difference between authority and permission. He stood. She looked at him. "The study," she said. "I will need a desk in the study. A proper one, not the small table from the morning room. There is a mahogany one in the attic that was your grandmother's." He said, "I will have it brought down today." She said, "The Bexley accounts need to be reviewed fully, not just the figures I have been tracking. I want a complete audit." He said, "I will arrange it." She said, "Thomas Crail needs a second course of the compound from the apothecary. I left the formula with Hesba, but someone should ride to the village this afternoon." He said, "I will go myself." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not, in the technical sense, a conversation, but that covered more ground than most conversations she had participated in over the previous 3 years. She looked down at the paper on the desk. "He stayed Edward," she said, "the name, not his title, his name." She had not used it before, not once, not in 3 years, he said, very quietly. Yes, she said, sit down. He sat. The morning room was warm. Someone had built the fire up, which was Nan's work almost certainly, with characteristic lack of subtlety. The light was the thin gold of an October afternoon. Charlotte set down her pen. She did not say anything else for a moment, and he did not require her to, and that specific quality of silence that did not demand to be filled was new, and she allowed herself, carefully, to notice it. She said, "You have a great deal of ground to recover." "I know," he said. "I am not going to pretend that you do not. I am not asking you to." "Good," she said. She picked up her pen again. "Then we will start with the accounts." That evening they ate dinner at the same time, at the same end of the table, closest enough to pass the salt without difficulty. No one had been asked to arrange this. It had simply happened, the way things happen when neither party is working to prevent them. The candle in the small brass holder from her room had been placed on the table between them. She did not know when it had appeared there, whether it was Nan or Hesba or Edward himself, and she found she did not need to know. It was there. It was lit. The dining room smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and the remains of something Hesba had made with autumn herbs. They did not talk about the auction house. They did not talk about the letter. They talked about the north quarter field rotation, and whether the east pasture was worth fencing, and the condition of the lane between Marlstoke Hall and the village. It was in every practical sense the same kind of dinner they had been having for 3 years. It was not the same dinner. This was not a love story. It was a ledger, finally balanced 2 columns that had been kept separate for 3 years, entered at last on the same page, in the same hand, in ink that would not dissolve. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself, that works quietly, in kitchens and corridors, in columns of figures and careful conversations with creditors who never learn whose wife they are dealing with. Charlotte Hartley did not wait to be seen. She built something worth seeing, and then she made the harder choice. To stay, not because she had no other option, but because she had decided that what she had made was hers, and she would not leave it. If you have ever been the person in the room that no one counted, and then proven, quietly and without fanfare, that the room could not have stood without you, this story was for you. If it moved you, please like and share it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Hit the bell, and you will be the first to know when a new story arrives. Now, here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know what you think in the comments. Did Edward deserve a second chance, or did Charlotte simply make the smarter move by going back on her own terms, knowing she held all the cards? Was this forgiveness, or was it strategy? Because I am not sure the story lets you have both answers at once, and I think that is the point. Thank you for listening. The next story is coming soon, and I think you are going to have a great deal to say about it.